Welcome to Shalom and Beyond, where we explore the intersections of Jewish thought, history, and contemporary issues. I'm David Stein.
And I'm Eli Rosenberg. Today, we're diving into a provocative book by Tiffany Gerdine titled Seeking Peace: Biblical Solutions to the Israel Palestine Conflict. It's available on Amazon, and we've both taken the time to read and reflect on it.
So let's start with the premise of the book. Seeking Peace: Biblical Solutions to the Israel Palestine Conflict. That's a bold title, right?
Very bold. Tiffany Gerdine frames the conflict not through political strategy or diplomacy, but through biblical ethics, specifically Christian teachings. Her core argument is that the conflict, at its heart, is spiritual, and therefore the solution has to come from spiritual principles like humility, forgiveness, and biblical justice.
Exactly. She places a strong emphasis on turning the heart before turning the map, so to speak. That peace can't happen unless there's inner transformation of individuals, leaders, and even nations. It's an admirable message, and I think it reflects a sincere desire to move past the cycles of hatred and retaliation.
Yeah. What struck me early on was how she invokes Jesus' teachings, like "Blessed are the peacemakers" and "Love your enemy," as not just moral advice, but as a kind of blueprint for resolving entrenched conflict. Now, obviously, as Jews, we're coming from a different textual tradition, but there are echoes of this idea in our own teachings, like "Seek peace and pursue it" from Psalm 34.
Totally. Jewish thought doesn't shy away from the idea that peace is paramount. The Talmud even says that peace is one of the names of God. But what's different here is how Gerdine really centers peace, not as a policy outcome, but as a spiritual posture. That's not a mainstream way of framing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, certainly not in political science departments or Knesset debates.
And you know what? That's both the strength and the limitation of her book. On one hand, it brings in a moral vocabulary that's often missing from the geopolitical conversation. On the other hand, it risks sounding naive if you don't acknowledge how deep the political roots of this conflict really are. Settlements, borders, rights of return, all of that.
Yeah, you can't forgive your way around a checkpoint or pray through a blockade. That's where I think the book might lose readers who are more grounded in the policy and realpolitik of the region. But at the same time, I don't think she's trying to write a white paper.
No, it reads more like a devotional or theological reflection, almost like she's trying to call the reader, particularly Christian readers, into a moral awakening. Like, hey, don't just take sides politically, consider what your scriptures say about reconciliation and justice. That's something I respect.
And she does attempt to balance it. She's not just preaching at Israelis or Palestinians, she's challenging her own community too. I noticed that in the sections where she calls out Western complicity, or the way many Christians blindly align with one side without understanding the human cost for the other.
Right? That's gutsy. It's not just a book about peace out there. It's also a mirror for readers asking, are you really being a peacemaker in your heart, in your advocacy, in how you talk about this issue?
Exactly. She's pushing for a kind of moral inventory, and that part transcends religion. Whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or secular for that matter, there's something compelling about being called back to basic decency.
Still, I found myself wondering, who is the intended audience? Because if it's just other Christians, maybe it's a much-needed voice. But if it's meant to influence Jewish or Muslim readers too, it might miss the mark due to the strong, Christ-centered framing.
That's an important point. We'll get into that more in the next segment when we talk about audience reach and reception. But as a premise, faith-based reconciliation, it's rare and, in a way, refreshing.
Definitely. It's not a substitute for diplomacy or policy, but it could be a powerful supplement to it. Especially in a world where we often reduce this conflict to slogans or sides. A book like this reminds us that hearts matter.
Well said. It's a humanizing book, even if it's not a comprehensive one. And maybe, in today's climate, that's exactly what's needed to start a deeper conversation.
Yes, it is.
All right, moving on. Let's talk about the book's intended audience and its broader appeal. Because honestly, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of Seeking Peace. Eli, who do you think Tiffany Gerdine wrote this book for?
That's a good question. My sense is she primarily wrote it for a Christian audience, specifically American Christians who are grappling with how to ethically approach the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can feel that in the tone, the heavy use of New Testament references, and the way she invites the reader to return to Jesus' example.
Yeah, it's very much framed around a kind of theological reckoning. It reminds me of some liberation theology or even writings from the Christian peace tradition, like Mennonite or Quaker voices. And you're right, for people in those circles, this book could feel like both a challenge and a spiritual guide.
But when it comes to non-Christian readers, especially Jews and Muslims, I'm not sure the book fully lands.
I agree. As a Jewish reader, I felt a bit on the outside looking in. Not alienated necessarily, but the theological grounding didn't speak to my tradition. There's a lot of language about Jesus as the ultimate peacemaker, which, makes sense within her faith context. But it can be limiting when you're trying to address a multi-faith conflict.
Exactly. Like, if your book is offering biblical solutions to a conflict involving Jews, Muslims, and Christians, but 90% of your framework comes from one tradition, you may unintentionally shut down dialogue before it begins. That said, I do think there's something universal in her call to humility and repentance. That transcends religious boundaries.
And I will say the parts where she addresses Western Christians who uncritically support one side, usually Israel, without understanding the human cost, that's powerful, and she does it without demonizing anyone. She's challenging people to think more critically and compassionately.
That's true. But let's talk accessibility, in both the intellectual and emotional sense. Do you think the book is accessible to people who aren't super well-versed in theology or the politics of the region?
That's a tricky one. I think she tries to keep the language approachable. It's not overly academic or jargon-heavy. But there are moments where I felt like the book assumes the reader has a certain level of biblical literacy, especially familiarity with Jesus' teachings.
Same here. And even politically, while she touches on key moments, the Nakba, the Six-Day War, the settlements, she doesn't go deep into the historical nuance. That could be a strength or a weakness, depending on what you're looking for. For someone brand new to the topic, it's a starting point. But for those wanting a comprehensive understanding, it's going to feel a little surface level.
Right. So here's the big question. Can this book become a bestseller?
Honestly, it depends on a few things. If it gets picked up by key voices in the Christian peace movement, or even just by progressive Christian influencers, it could gain real traction, especially with everything happening in the region. People are searching for alternative voices, peaceful approaches.
Yes, the timing is crucial. There's so much heartbreak, so much polarization. A book that steps out of the whose side are you on binary and instead asks, how can we heal? That message could resonate widely, especially if positioned correctly.
But to hit bestseller status, it probably needs two things: visibility and a bridge-building strategy. Visibility through strong endorsements, maybe from interfaith leaders, peace activists, or theologians. And bridge-building by expanding the framing a bit, so non-Christians feel more invited into the conversation.
Totally. Even just a few added chapters or footnotes exploring Jewish and Muslim perspectives on peace, or highlighting interfaith efforts on the ground in Israel Palestine could make a world of difference in broadening the appeal.
Yeah, and I think there's potential here. You can feel that Gerdine's heart is in the right place. She's not pushing a political agenda. She's offering a moral one that can be very powerful when paired with the right platform.
So bottom line, if she leans into coalition building, partners with peacemakers from other traditions, and gets the book into the right hands, absolutely, it could catch fire. Maybe not in a mass market thriller kind of way, but as a conversation changer? Yes.
Agreed. I don't think it's a bestseller by default, but it has the seeds of one, especially in faith-based and activist circles.
And we'll get more into that in the next segment. What could make this book not just good, but transformative?
Yes, definitely.
All right, so let's get into the core of the book. Not just who it's for or what it's trying to do, but how well it actually does it. Eli, what stood out to you most about the way Gerdine approached this topic?
I'll start with the positive. One thing I really appreciated is her tone. Tiffany writes with sincerity and emotional clarity. This isn't some distant academic essay or policy think piece. It feels like someone wrestling with a moral and spiritual burden and inviting the reader to join her in that wrestling.
Yes, I felt that too. There's a kind of raw earnestness, which is refreshing. She's not pretending to have all the answers. She's just being real about her process. Here's what I've studied, here's what Scripture says to me, and here's how I think we might approach peace differently.
And honestly, that might be one of the book's greatest strengths. In an era when people are so dug into ideological trenches, someone coming at it with humility and a desire to listen, to Scripture, to others, to conscience, that's rare.
Totally agree. I also liked how she frames peace as a spiritual discipline. It's not just a political goal or an end game. It's a way of being, rooted in the teachings of Jesus, particularly the Sermon on the Mount. That framework is very strong for readers who are open to it.
Yes, but now let's pivot a little, because with that strength comes a potential limitation. And it's a big one. When you ground your whole argument in Christian theology, specifically New Testament ethics, you risk excluding or even unintentionally marginalizing the very people you're trying to speak about, namely Jews and Muslims.
Right. And I think it's worth saying directly, if you're offering solutions to the Israel Palestine conflict, you have to do more than just quote Jesus. That might inspire your Christian audience, but what about Palestinians who are Muslim? Or Israelis who are Jewish and feel very differently about the biblical narrative?
Exactly. I wanted to hear more from those voices. She references them, yes. There are mentions of injustice, checkpoints, loss of land, but it's second-hand. There's not much first-person testimony. Not a lot of direct quotes from Palestinians or Israelis.
That's a great point. Imagine how powerful it would have been to include testimonies from people on the ground, Palestinian Christians, Israeli human rights activists, even rabbis or imams who are working toward peace. It would have made the theology feel rooted in lived experience.
Right now, it feels a bit like a reflection from a distance. And to be fair, she's writing from the US, so that makes sense. But it does raise the question, how much can you say about peace in the Middle East if you're not deeply connected to the region?
I think she's aware of that. She doesn't try to be an authority on geopolitics. But where the book is strongest is in challenging the Western Christian narrative, especially that kind of knee-jerk pro-Israel stance that ignores the suffering of Palestinians.
That section where she talks about Christians using prophecy to justify violence or political apathy, that was sharp, that was bold, and honestly, I haven't seen it written quite that way before. She really calls out the spiritual cost of being ideologically lazy.
Yeah, she's not afraid to push her own community, and that's commendable. She's not doing it for shock value either. It's thoughtful. But I would have liked to see more depth when it comes to the complexities of the conflict. Historical context, power dynamics, settler colonialism, occupation, and even intra-Palestinian divisions.
Totally. Like she mentions checkpoints and displacement, but there's no deeper unpacking of how those systems work, what daily life is like for Palestinians under occupation, or how Israeli policy has evolved over time. The nuance just isn't there.
Which brings us to another limitation. The book sometimes treats peace as a purely moral choice, as if individuals on both sides just need to forgive and move on. That's powerful on a spiritual level, but peace also involves justice, reparations, safety, legal rights. It's not just about feelings, it's about structures.
Yes, you can't forgive your way out of apartheid or displacement. You can pray for peace, but you also have to work for systemic change. And I think that's where the book falls a little short. The theology is strong, but the praxis, the action plan, is underdeveloped.
I wonder if that's a second book waiting to happen. A follow-up that gets into the weeds of what biblical justice looks like in practice in this specific context. Because what Gerdine has done here is start the conversation. But there's a long way to go.
Still, there's real value in what she's offered. For someone new to this conversation, especially a Christian who's never questioned the standard talking points about Israel, this could be a game changer. It's a book that can open doors.
Totally. It's not the final word. but maybe it's the first word for some people, and that's no small thing.
Agreed. So to sum it up, strong theology? Yes. Powerful moral vision? Absolutely. Deep geopolitical context? Not really. Multi-faith engagement? Needs work. Transformational potential? If paired with the right conversations, yes.
Well said. And in the next segment, we'll talk about where this book could go from here and how it might inspire other voices, other movements, and maybe even some real-world change. All right, so let's talk long-term. Let's ask the big question. Could this book be a bestseller? And more importantly, what would need to happen for it to really reach that kind of influence?
It's a great question. I think the short answer is yes, it could, with the right push. But the more nuanced answer is it needs some strategic pivots to get there.
Totally. First off, the market is there. We're in a moment where more Christians, especially younger Christians, are questioning long-held assumptions about Israel, Palestine, politics, and justice. There's a hunger for resources that bring faith and justice together in a fresh, authentic way.
Exactly. The deconstruction movement, the post-evangelical shift, even progressive Catholic and mainline Protestant spaces. This book could resonate deeply in those communities. It fills a gap. But to make that leap into mainstream consciousness, you need visibility and credibility building moments.
Right? It's not just about writing a good book anymore. It's about building a platform around the message. Think podcast appearances, public dialogues, interfaith panels, maybe even turning some chapters into short-form videos or op-eds. Because Tiffany Gerdine has a voice that's unafraid, but the world needs to hear it.
And I'll add this. The title has real potential. Seeking peace is universal. It's timeless. Pair that with a subtitle like Biblical Solutions to the Israel Palestine Conflict. You're immediately drawing in readers who are curious, spiritually minded, and probably exhausted by partisan noise. That's a powerful combination.
Yeah, and it makes me think, if she were to do a second edition, it might help to include things like study questions for church or book clubs, testimonials or quotes from Christians, Jews, and Muslims who read it and were moved. A deeper dive into practical steps readers can take. Donate, learn, unlearn, travel, advocate, etc.
Great ideas. Because one thing that separates a good book from a movement-building book is application. This book currently feels like a powerful inner monologue. If Gerdine can invite the reader to turn reflection into action, that's when transformation happens.
Let's talk author presence too. Because let's be real, books become bestsellers because of more than just content. It's about the story of the author, the way she connects with her audience, and how she shows up in conversation.
Exactly. And from the writing, Tiffany Gerdine seems very real, very honest. If she were to step into more live dialogue, especially with Jewish and Palestinian voices, there's an opportunity to model exactly the kind of bridge building the book calls for.
She's uniquely positioned for that. As a Christian woman coming from a place of conviction, she's not trying to erase other narratives. She's trying to recenter peace in a biblically grounded way. But if she could include more collaborative voices in her next work, or even in follow-up podcasts or YouTube conversations, it would deepen the reach.
That's what I'd love to see, a Seeking Peace podcast or panel series with Jewish, Muslim, and Christian thinkers, activists, theologians, even skeptics. That's how you take a book and make it a living project.
Yes, and honestly, the potential's there for speaking engagements, church tours, interfaith summits. I could imagine this book being taught in seminaries or even being part of peace-building workshops.
If she gets the right endorsements or partnerships, like from someone at Sojourners, the Telos Group, maybe even Desmond Tutu's Peace Foundation, this could blow up in the best possible way.
It's also worth saying, this book already has value. Whether it becomes a bestseller or not, it's contributing to a moral conversation that matters. That's more important than sales numbers.
Absolutely. But it's also fair to want the message to spread. And this book deserves a wider audience, because it's not shouting, it's inviting. It doesn't demonize, it humanizes. In a media landscape where outrage sells, that's countercultural.
So, final thoughts on the impact?
I'd say seeking peace is a beginning, not a conclusion. It opens a sacred space for reflection, but it also demands community. The next step is amplification, across platforms, across faiths, and across borders.
And I'd say Tiffany Gerdine has given the church, and really the broader world, a theological provocation. The kind that doesn't just ask you to agree or disagree, it asks you to change. And that's the kind of book that can change the world, if enough people read it.
Beautifully said, man.
Coming up after the break, we'll do our final segment, listener Q&A and our worth the read verdict. Stick around.
Yes.
All right, welcome back. This is our final segment for today's episode on Seeking Peace, Biblical Solutions to the Israel Palestine Conflict by Tiffany Gerdine. We've taken you through the big themes, strengths, and challenges, and now it's time for the final verdict. But before we dive into that, we've got a couple of listener questions that came in through Instagram and our Patreon community.
Yeah, we always love hearing from you guys. So here's one from Miriam in Chicago. She asks, as a Jewish woman who supports peace but is skeptical of Christian interpretations of Israel's role in Scripture, is this book going to feel dismissive of Jewish perspectives?
That's such an important question. Honestly, no, I wouldn't say it's dismissive, but I would say it's written very clearly from a Christian theological lens. Tiffany Gerdine makes it obvious that her primary audience is Christian readers, especially those who were raised to see the modern state of Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
Exactly. She's not attempting to retell Jewish history from a Jewish voice, which I respect, but it's also not a dialogue with Jewish theology. So for Jewish readers, it might feel a little one-sided at times, not out of hostility, but simply because that's not the book's goal.
Right? But if you're someone like Miriam, Jewish, open, curious, reading this book can actually give you a valuable window into the theological narratives that shape so much of American Christian political discourse. It's not always comfortable, but it is enlightening.
Totally. And I think the more we read each other's interpretations, the better chance we have at real interfaith peace building.
Here's another one. This is from a listener named Ryan in Austin. He asks, do you think this book could be used in a church setting? Like, is it too academic or political for a small group?
Good question. I'd say no, it's not too academic at all. In fact, it's pretty accessible. The tone is conversational, and while the subject matter is complex, the book reads more like a guided reflection than a textbook or academic treatise.
Agreed. And I think it could be very impactful in churches that are beginning to question Christian Zionism or want to explore what it means to be peacemakers from a biblical standpoint. A few tweaks, like added discussion questions, would make it even better for group use.
Yeah. If Gerdine adds a companion workbook or study guide, this could easily become a 6-week series in progressive or even moderate churches.
All right, final segment, the moment of truth. Eli, is Seeking Peace worth the read?
Yes. For a few key audiences, I'd say it's essential reading. If you're a Christian who's beginning to question the traditional pro-Israel stance you were taught growing up, or you're someone longing for a more Christ-centered vision of justice in the Middle East, this book will hit home.
I'm with you. It's not perfect, and it doesn't claim to be, but its honesty is refreshing. Gerdine isn't trying to convert people to a political agenda. She's inviting them into spiritual self-examination, which is rare these days. I found myself under conviction, not because I disagreed with her, but because I hadn't really sat with the moral tension the way she had.
Same here. It reminded me that peace isn't passive. It's something we seek, actively. And that means confronting uncomfortable truths, even when they challenge your theology or your patriotism.
All right, let's do our traditional 3-point takeaway. I'll go first. Honest theology. This book confronts deep-rooted Christian ideologies with scriptural humility. A fresh voice. Tiffany Gerdine brings an unapologetic but compassionate tone that's rare in the Israel-Palestine debate. Platform potential. With more public engagement, this message could reach a global audience.
Love that. Here are mine. Not for the fragile. If you want your theology bubble-wrapped, this book isn't for you. But if you want truth spoken in love, it's a gift. Start of a journey. This book isn't the whole conversation. It's a crucial starting point for Christians who want to walk toward peace. Rooted in Jesus. At the end of the day, this is a Jesus-centered plea for reconciliation. And in today's climate, that's powerful.
Couldn't have said it better. So, is Seeking Peace a future bestseller? Maybe. But even if it's not, it's already doing something far more valuable. It's waking up the conscience of the church.
And that, my friends, is worth the read.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Table Talks and Torah Takes. If you read Seeking Peace or have thoughts to add, hit us up on socials or email us at hello@torahpodcast.com.
Don't forget to rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It helps more thoughtful people like you find the show.
And until next time, seek peace, pursue justice, and never stop asking good questions.